Hello and welcome back to Technically Speaking. We are in our first episode of our summer series, which will be focusing on some decisions you can make and levers you can pull in Unqork to make sure the performance of your applications is amazing. It'll also teach you how to balance the needs of your project at the same time. Over the next 8 weeks, we'll be looking at topics from RBAC to workflow and modularity to screen rendering. In this first episode, we have Craig Sopata joining us to discuss data storage in Unqork and what decisions are the keystones to creating and designing your data storage strategy. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Dara. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like this is just like an extension of our one-on-one, except now people just get to observe us having our weekly touch points with each other. But anyway, excited about the summer series. I think it's good to talk about these things that are like the possibilities. Like, I don't think in the next 8 sessions, you'll say anything that's like, you need to do this. It's more like, this is a positive for doing this way, and this is a positive for doing this other thing this way. And we'll go through this a little bit in today's session, but like, you need to understand what you're trying to build and what you're trying to get to, and then all of that. And this is sort of presenting some of the choices and some of the different sort of levers you can pull when building your application.
Absolutely. And you and I talk a lot about giving people the critical thinking skills to make the decisions when it's not as cut and dry as the best practices we put out there, so that they can look at something and decide what the best way to deal with a unique situation is.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's not like we're not just going to say do X, because this X isn't necessarily going to work for all the situations that you're going to be in. So, example for data storage, we're going to throw out a couple of different things we've seen in the past, things we've talked about when we go through applications. And there's no right answer here. I mean, there's a right answer for your situation, but that answer is not the same answer for another situation.
Absolutely. And you touched briefly on data storage, but let's start for those folks who are not familiar with data storage or the terminology we're using. What is data storage?
Sure. So I was saying before this, we were kind of chatting, talking to some other people. I was thinking about this the other day when I was looking for something that well, let's just, store, obviously everyone knows what storage is. Like, I don't know, all my socks are in my sock drawer or something like that. Or I moved recently and I had to pack up all my stuff and get it to this new city. So it's pretty clear, I stored a bunch of clothes and, computer, etc. stuff. Right? So what's data? Data is just a bunch of, ultimately zeros and ones that are related to information about your application, right? If we're talking about insurance, it's your policies, it's your quotes, it's your, claims, etc. Right? And so that makes up your data. So, right? So let's say data storage, okay, great. So where are we going to put all this, right? And it's going to be in a database, or maybe it's in a file, or in some other kind of storage that you might have. But so ultimately that's data storage, right? Just where are we going to put all these zeros and ones and information that you're gathering from your end users, or gathering from other systems that are running, that your application is going to need to read.
So when we think about Unqork, where are some places that we can store data? What are our options in order
Yeah,
to?
totally. So I mean, I think ultimately what we'll probably talk about most today is just submissions, right? So Unqork, you have the ability to create, update, read, delete submissions, right? And ultimately those submissions live in a database, right? There's a couple other places in Unqork that you can store data, right? Data reference tables, or maybe just have a data table within a module that you've set some data. Maybe even it's a drop down, and the options for that drop down are just saved in that particular component, right? Those kind of all are different ways of storing the data, and each one of those that I just mentioned have their own pros and cons if you were going about building an application. We could maybe touch on that a little bit as well. But ultimately, there's also sort of, I guess, you can upload some of, like, hey, I have an icon or a GIF, or maybe there's some other piece of data, a file that describes that, what the process is that you want to have somebody, give somebody the ability to download. So either upload those to like our, S3 bucket, or, save those ahead of time as sort of some metadata for your, or some additional data for your application.
Great. And are there options to store maybe outside of Unqork and then go grab it if you needed it?
Yeah, so totally. So so now, like I sort of alluded to, stuff stored in my house. I moved things. But like hypothetically, or not hypothetically, if I went to my parents' basement right now, I could go and find all of my baseball cards from when I was a kid, right? So like, you know, kind of I chose like, hey, I'm not going to read this data very often. I'm not going to access it. So like I could leave it in this location, or maybe the cost of moving all of these things to this new location or my new house is too much for me to pay, or I wouldn't want to pay. And so given sort of that, like that read, that access pattern, maybe it's best to leave it where it is, right? And so if we think about clients, very rarely, or maybe, I would say rarely, like you have a client who's just like, hey, we have a brand new process. We want to build it with Unqork. We've never like captured this kind of information before. We haven't had this type of application before. We're starting completely brand new. All right, great. Maybe that makes some of these choices a little bit easier. But like say, like most of our clients are going to have already been in existence for a while, right? Like you're the insurance company that has, you know, millions or even just like hundreds of policies that you've already captured in another system, and maybe that other system's going to live on, or in the Unqork application in this sense, is going to be a new piece of this, right? And you kind of like, what is your system of record, right? Where is that one place that I would go to for like the trusted location of that data, right? And maybe you want that to stay the same because there's upstream processes that are dependent upon it, and there's downstream processes that know about this location for it, right? So hey, how do we get data into Unqork, right? Well, Unqork, at the easiest way of talking about this, has the ability to connect to most any like REST endpoint, right? So if your data exposes APIs for some of the same operations we talked about earlier, to create data or read data, update data, maybe even delete data, you can access it from your Unqork application, right? And so now, like, your data can stay here in your like, in your on-prem database that you've exposed via APIs, or some other location, other storage location that you have, that you want to just access that data via API, right? So we can pull from there, read and write from there, right? And so, um, it's certainly one option, right? And another might be like, hey, we have some data that we want you to read from us, but like on a periodic basis, maybe not a real-time basis. So, potentially you could set up, hey, we're gonna read from a particular file location, every night, right? 2 a.m. This other process that you run has updated, and there'd be some refresh data there. So read from that location and pull that in, right? And so now we've sort of talked about and saved that into Unqork, right? And so we kind of just talked about a few different things here, right? You can store your data in Unqork. You could store your data or access this data from a third party or from the client, or some hybrid solution thereof, right? Where some of this data that, like we said, is updated infrequently, nightly, monthly. Maybe you would want to pull that over, cache it in Unqork, so that way it's easier to read it, and maybe it's only accessible or only exists as this file. And we wouldn't want to do a thing where every time, let's say, Dara, you visit this page, that it goes and like SFTPs this file over, unpacks it all, and then presents some data to you. And that would be probably a non-desired experience for you. You might have to wait for that file to transfer, for all the other work to do to send this back to you, right? So if we think about, well, why might you want that data in Unqork, right? Well, it's going to reduce the number of calls between Unqork and other places, right? It also gives the creators the ability to sort of set a particular schema or the way they want their data to look or be shaped, right? And so maybe this file or maybe the other source that we're reading from has like, it's like super nested. There's, you have to traverse some like long path to get to something that you always want to read. Maybe it's better to like bring this to a different location that makes it easier for all of the other, reading that we're going to be doing in Unqork, right? And with that, right, it gives us the ability to like, you know, index the data and improve the time that it's going to take to retrieve this. And so back to like a clothes analogy, right? Like, I don't know, I've sort of indexed my clothing. Like all my socks live in my sock drawer, right? So I know I can go to this one drawer and get to socks pretty quickly. And I know that I can go to another drawer and find t-shirts and stuff like that. And I know that like, hey, none of my kids clothes are in this particular closet because I moved that to a different location, right? So in some capacity, this is what indexing might do to help faster retrieval of some of the data that you save. So all of that now is like in the Unqork control. But we touched on some of the other reasons why maybe you want to leave that data where it is, right? You already have existing systems, that are producing data into that or consuming data from a particular database or storage location. And so you want to leverage that, leave that alone. So now you can expose some of that data, via APIs to allow Unqork to get access to it, right? And now you don't need to, by keeping that single system of record, that golden copy, you don't need to do any reconciliation as data is being updated throughout the day. It's that one location here, right? I mean, maybe there is something to be said for like, hey, we're the only thing making updates to this is Unqork, so we'll make updates throughout the day and save those in Unqork because maybe those will be frequently accessed records. But at the end of the day, we'll push all those updates to your third party. Again, maybe that's a solution that would work for you, maybe not, right? And again, all about like, it's the sort of the art of the possible or different ways you might set this up. And like I said, so keeping that data, you get to maintain that data on-prem, right? If for some reason way down the road you decide, you want to move other things or have other applications access this data, and sure, you could expose that via APIs from Unqork, but you get to maintain that data on-prem and whatever additional security features or enhancements you want around that, you get to have like full control over it, right? And again, you also can set up your own backups. How often, Unqork does its backups, but maybe you have something, special that you need to do yourself. And sort of we talked about like a third option, combining the first two, where it makes sense to bring some things into Unqork or where it might make sense to leave things on the client site. And with that again, it's like, who needs are these things really time sensitive? Are they really large? Are they, not going to change very often? So some of these might make more sense to move or leave in the same place, right? So yeah, hopefully I went through a lot in that bit there. So anything you want to like go back on, let me know.
You touched really nicely on what are the types and what are the pros of each of the different types. So whether it's with Unqork, with either the client or some offsite, not Unqork place, or some sort of hybrid. And, are there any rules of thumb when you're making that decision? I know we went through some examples, but are there any things that people should be thinking about and saying, if I need this more than 12 times a day, then it should be with me in Unqork. But if it's only 11, maybe it's okay.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think it touched on some of those things as I was just speaking, but right. And I think it comes back to again, some of the questions on how often is this data going to update versus, how many times do I need to read it? So let's take example like, some data, and I mentioned like a drop down earlier, and the fact that I could sort of hard code some of the drop down settings in the particular drop down. Okay, well that's sort of fine. I don't need to run an extra query to like get the choices for that drop down when I load a page. And if they never change or very, very infrequently change, then that might make sense, right? And if that's like the only place that I need to use this or reference it, let's say in your application, you just have a US states drop down. Okay, well, I don't think we've had any changes to that in a few years. So you probably have a pretty like safe idea that it's not going to change. So maybe it makes sense to set it there, right? Or but maybe that's something else that updates more frequently. And I'll go back to insurance as an example. Like, hey, we have new products. Well, there might be new products launching periodically. So I want that to actually read from some other reference location because I can update that. And then as soon as I make an update to this, collection over here, it should, it would reflect in my dropdown, right? So as I, refresh the page, I made this update. Hey, I see new things here. And I didn't have to like make any code changes. I just made a change to the data, right? And sort of with that, we talked about, who's maintaining the sort of master of that record, right? And maybe the third party you're working with might keep that list of products to themselves, right? And keep that in their system. And again, like, hey, we'll only update products on a daily basis, and we'll put that refresh product list out on some, third part out in some location, or maybe you should check every hour for updates. And you can either, read a file or hit an endpoint that can give you that information back. And maybe that's a longer list. And so we'll cache it. And I think this is like a topic of yours or a topic of the summer series that's coming up, like, caching and different ways of thinking about caching. But in this example, right now we're going to save some submissions in Unqork for that reference data and keep it there, right? So anyway, that was kind of back to some of the rules of thumb, right? How often is this data going to change? Like, we talked about this earlier. Like, what's the system of record, right? The system of record exists on the third party site because there's a bunch of other people who are consumers of that data. So maybe it doesn't make sense to bring it into Unqork. And I think some of the other things, as far as like rules of thumb is, how timely do you need this, to access this information, right? And maybe there's some, some of that would be better to leave it in the third party or to bring it into Unqork, depending on, again, how big that data is, where the system of record is going to be in the future, right? If we talked a little bit about, or I mentioned moving, so maybe like the first thing you want to do is actually set up like a data migration plan. You've decided actually Unqork's going to be my system of record going forward. So the first thing we'll do is before we open this website up to any other individuals, out to the public, we're going to move records into Unqork, right? So we have a one-time migration of the data, into Unqork, and then we'll go forward with it from that point. And now Unqork's become, the system of record. So again, all options kind of, at our disposal here.
Yeah, it's sometimes great that we get all of these options and we can build something custom. But there are moments where it feels overwhelming. So thank you for kind of walking through that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to mention, one other maybe rule of thumb, maybe a pro, and I think it dovetails a little bit with, the, backups or things or management of a data service is like, think of, and I know this is another one of your upcoming topics is on RBAC, right? There's a lot of built-in RBAC around in Unqork to see who has access to these submissions, what role you're in, what group you're in, will dictate what data you can see. And maybe you want to manage that in Unqork, or maybe you would prefer to have that managed, on your side, right? And I think again, another sort of thing to talk through, your counterparty if building an application for someone in the future.
Absolutely. And I'm sure as we touch on RBAC, that will be a consideration we take in as well. Absolutely.
Yep.
And anything else you want to leave us with on data storage?
No, I don't think so. Nothing more from myself except, like we kind of talked about. You start talking about storage and it just brings up, some of these like troubles, I went to thinking about all of, my physical storage, problems moving, or like, finding a storage unit or finding someone to move this stuff. And then, like in some way, how that relates to data and some of the other decisions that you need to make when doing this. And like, again, like I said, focus of this is kind of on submissions in Unqork in some capacity. So, go out, read, the community documentation on, data models, data structures, about, reading and writing submissions in Unqork. And, hopefully some of what we spoke about today will be helpful in your next application.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, Craig, and thank you everyone that's online watching us. We appreciate you being here. We will be back next week, same time, tackling another part of performance.
Thanks, Dara.